Now, an Oscar-winning director, Chloe Zhao, is being hailed as the pride of the Chinese people. But posts about her victory at the Academy Awards are being censored on the country's most popular social media platform. Ms. Zhao has become the first Asian woman to win Best Director for her film Nomadland. The ceremony was not broadcast on the mainland, but many were able to watch clips of her acceptance speech on Weibo. Within an hour, they began to disappear, though.
When I was growing up in China, my dad and I used to play this game. We would memorize classic Chinese poems and texts, and we would recite it together and try to finish each other's sentences. And there's one that I remember so dearly. It's called the Three Character Classics. And the first phrase goes, 人之初，性本善. People at birth are inherently good.
Joining me live is Asia correspondent Adrian Brown. Adrian, what can we make of this censorship?
Well, you know, Laura, this Oscar ceremony is taking place, as your previous item indicated, against the backdrop of a Cold War. And from the perspective of Beijing, Chloe Zhao's win is political. You know, they can accept critics, but the worst thing in China's eyes is a critic who is successful. And Chloe Zhao is a successful critic. Her crime, if you like, was that 8 years ago, she gave an interview in which she criticized the regime, saying that she'd grown up in a country of lies. Now, I'm sure, you know, film directors in Australia have used much stronger language when talking about their government. But in China, you know, there's no statute of limitations, and that sort of thing remains very much on the statute book. China's leaders have not forgotten. On social media, as you indicated in your introduction, there was widespread praise before China's censorship machine began cranking up, and nowhere do they do censorship better than on the mainland. People in the street, though, were, you know, full of praise for the fact that a Chinese woman had reached the apogee of US cinema. But online, those comments have been scrubbed away. And of course, you know, the Oscar ceremony was not shown in China, and it wasn't shown for the first time in 52 years here in Hong Kong, because there was also another reason for that, Laura. One of the short documentary nominations was about the protests here in Hong Kong in 2019. And of course, what the authorities on the mainland wanted to avoid was that being mentioned, that, and a deeper fear was that, in fact, it might even win. It didn't win, but the director of the documentary that did win still raised the Hong Kong protests in his speech, saying the protesters in Hong Kong should not be forgotten. So from a Chinese perspective, not a great night.
Absolutely, and it's extraordinary that that level of censorship has reached Hong Kong, but it's not quite on par with the mainland yet. What were you able to see of the Oscars? Did you see the same scrubbing of comments, scrubbing of clips?
You know, here in Hong Kong, we can still get Twitter. You don't get Twitter on the mainland. You get the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, which is Weibo. Those clips, you know, posts were appearing in the minutes after the award was announced, but they quickly disappeared, literally, you know, minutes later. Here in Hong Kong, we didn't have the same problem, but what is different this year is that it wasn't shown live. What people were treated to were recorded highlights of the ceremony. Of course, there was no mention of the fact that somebody raised the documentary about the protest. That wasn't mentioned here in Hong Kong.
It's so chilling indeed, Adrian. And now there are mounting concerns surrounding the possible fake news law. What's that?
Well, last week, the Commissioner of Hong Kong Police, Tang, warned journalists that if they did what he called fake news, if they made reports that contained fake news in broadcasts or were published, then they would be punished, they would be prosecuted. That's fine. The problem is Hong Kong has no fake news law. So that has led to growing speculation that perhaps a fake news law is going to be on the statute books very soon. But the problem is, who defines what fake news is? Will that be the Hong Kong police? The Foreign Correspondents Club here in Hong Kong, you know, full disclosure, I'm a member, has written to the Commissioner of Police seeking an urgent clarification, because this comes at a time of increasing censorship here in Hong Kong. And if you were to get a fake news law, of course that would make the job of the journalists that much harder. And let's remember, there are fake news laws in other jurisdictions around the world, but these laws tend to happen in places where there is tight censorship and where governments are not held to account.
So, Adrian, the fear is that under these fake news laws, you could be reporting accurately and factually something that the regime might not like, and therefore you could be caught up in these laws depending on who gets to define them.
Yeah, that's right. I might find out, for instance, what China's next quarterly GDP figures are, and that figure could well be correct, but in the eyes of the authorities here, that could constitute fake news, even though the information I had was correct. It's in the eyes of the police now, it seems, to decide what is factual and what isn't fake news. So, it's another sign of, the way things are changing, and changing very rapidly.
Indeed. Adrian Brown, thanks so much for your time as always.
Thank you.